Ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoy my video, please click the like button and share the video. It is the only way the YouTube algorithms really notices me. I will be very grateful to you. The Ruins of My Forgotten Childhood. Scary story published by Scare Fiction. Read for you by Scare Fiction. Chapter 1. The Return. The car's engine hummed beneath Evan as he drove down the winding road, flanked by dense trees on both sides. The town appeared ahead just as small and quiet as he remembered, though the edges of his memory were fuzzy blurred like an old photograph left in the sun too long. He hadn't set foot in this town for over 20 years, and yet here he was, pulled back by something more than just his mother's death. The nightmares had started weeks ago, drawing him back to the place he swore he'd never return to. He passed familiar landmarks, abandoned gas stations, a crumbling church, and the small general store that had once been the center of town life. Nothing here had changed. Except for him. His knuckles tightened on the steering wheel as the turn for the old house came into view. The house loomed at the end of a long, overgrown driveway. His childhood home. Or what was left of it. The roof sagged, the windows were shattered, and vines crawled up the rotting wood like fingers trying to reclaim it. The place felt more dead than alive, yet the air buzzed with an unsettling energy. The ruins stood there, waiting, as if they'd been expecting him. Evan stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. A cold breeze, sharp for an early autumn afternoon, swept through the yard, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. Closer he got to the house, the heavier the air felt, as if the weight of the past clung to him. His chest tightened. His nightmares had all been the same. The house, the whispers, shadows moving just out of sight. His therapist told him it was grief manifesting, a way of processing his mother's death. But standing here, he knew it was more than that. Something lingered. He hesitated at the broken front steps, then stopped cold. From inside the ruins, a voice. Thin, high-pitched, unmistakably familiar. "Evan," it whispered. He froze, his heart hammering in his chest. It couldn't be. The voice was soft, like a child's, one he hadn't heard in decades, but it was clear as day, calling him by name. Evan. He looked around, but the yard was empty. The ruins, however, were not. Something or someone was waiting inside. Chapter 2. Ghosts of Memory. The voice echoed in Evan's ears, pulling him forward even as every instinct screamed for him to turn back. His pulse thundered as he stepped onto the rotting porch. The wooden boards groaned under his weight, threatening to give way at any moment. The front door hung crooked on its hinges, barely attached to the frame. Swallowing the rising dread, Evan pushed it open with a hesitant hand, the rusted hinges screeching like a wounded animal. Inside, the air was thick with dust and mildew. It smelled of rot and abandonment, as though time itself had forgotten this place. Shafts of weak light cut through the broken windows, illuminating the decay in patches, the sagging ceiling, peeling wallpaper, and vines that had snaked their way through the cracks in the foundation. The house was no longer a home. It was a tomb. As Evan moved deeper into the hallway, his eyes adjusted to the gloom, and with it came flashes brief, haunting glimpses of his childhood. He saw himself running through the halls, his sneakers slapping against the wooden floor. His mother stood by the window, her silhouette outlined by the sun, but her face blurred, just out of reach. He blinked, and it was gone. Only dust and ruin remained. The kitchen was worse. The ceiling had partially caved in, leaving broken beams and shattered glass scattered across the floor. Cabinets hung open, their contents spilled long ago, but Evans swore something had shifted. The sensation gnawed at him, a creeping unease that crawled up his spine. His gaze darted to the corner where an old chair sat, untouched by time. For a split second, he thought he saw movement, just the faintest twitch, as though someone had been sitting there moments before. His breath caught in his throat. The scratching started next. It was faint, like nails dragging against wood, coming from somewhere upstairs. He turned toward the stairs and the sound stopped, plunging the house into a dead, oppressive silence. He wasn't alone here. He could feel it. In the hallway, his foot nudged something on the floor. It was a drawing, crumpled and smeared with dirt. Evan picked it up, hands trembling. The childish lines showed a stick figure standing in front of a tall, dark figure with red eyes. Scrawled beneath it, in a familiar, childish scrawl, "He's waiting for me." The shadows around him seemed to shift, as if the house itself was watching. Chapter 3: Shadows of the Past. Evan stumbled out of the house, clutching the crumpled drawing, his pulse racing. The shadows inside clung to his skin, like something was watching him from behind the cracked walls. He needed air. He needed to get away. The town felt different now, less like a place he once knew and more like a distant memory blurred by time. As he drove into the center, the streets appeared emptier than he remembered. The once lively corner store now had dust-covered windows, the old diner was closed, and the few people walking along the sidewalks barely glanced at him. Those who did seemed to recognize him, but there was no warmth in their eyes, just wary glances and hushed whispers. Evan parked in front of a grocery store, stepping out into the faint afternoon sun. He could feel the stares on his back, the weight of the town's judgment pressing down on him. Inside, the smell of stale bread and cleaning supplies filled the air. He grabbed a basket and moved quickly through the aisles, hoping to avoid any unwanted conversations. "Evan?" The voice stopped him cold. He turned to see Mr. Carter, the town's aging mechanic, standing near the produce section. The man's face was lined with age, but his sharp blue eyes held the same intensity they always had. "I'll be damned," Carter said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Didn't think I'd see you back here." "Just here for a few days," Evan replied, keeping his voice steady. "Clearing up some things with my mom's old place." Carter's gaze darkened. "Your mama, she wasn't the same after your dad vanished, you know. Town folks always said that house wasn't right. Strange things happened up there." Evan's throat tightened. "Strange how?" Carter glanced around, lowering his voice. "People said they saw lights in the windows at night. Heard voices when no one was home. Some claimed your father was mixed up in things he shouldn't have been." Evan's chest tightened, memories clawing at the edges of his mind. His father had disappeared when he was young. He barely remembered him, only that he never came back. That night, Evan tossed and turned in bed, his mind churning with Carter's words. At some point, sleep took him, but it wasn't peaceful. In his dream, a dark figure stood over him, its breath cold against his skin. The voice, low and familiar, whispered, "Come home." Evan shot awake, gasping. The figure from his dream stood at the foot of his bed. Chapter 4: The Basement. Evan's heart pounded in his chest, the image of the dark figure from his dream still fresh in his mind. He sat up in bed, but the room was empty now, save for the oppressive silence. Sleep was impossible. The figure's words, "come home," echoed in his head like a warning or a threat. Morning light barely cut through the thick curtains as he made his decision. If he wanted answers, he needed to face the one place he'd avoided all his life, the basement. The memory of that dark, damp space sent a shiver down his spine, but he had no choice. Something in that house was waiting for him, and he wasn't going to run. The house creaked ominously as Evan made his way downstairs, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The basement door, tucked away in the far corner of the kitchen, loomed ahead like the maw of a beast waiting to swallow him whole. His hand trembled as he twisted the rusted doorknob, the wood groaning in protest as it swung open. A stale, musty smell wafted up from the depths below, carrying the scent of rot and decay. The flashlight in his hand flickered, its beam barely cutting through the thick darkness as he descended the creaking stairs. Each step seemed to pull him deeper into a place he didn't recognize, even though he had lived here as a child. The basement was worse than he imagined. Damp walls, streaked with mold, exposed pipes dripping with moisture, and the cold, suffocating air pressing in around him. His skin crawled, but something stronger than fear drove him forward. A compulsion. At the far end of the basement, hidden behind crumbling shelves and stacks of forgotten boxes, Evan found something that made his blood run cold. A door metal, rusted and locked. He didn't remember this. It wasn't here before. He hesitated for only a moment before grabbing an old crowbar and prying the lock loose. The door groaned open, revealing a small, hidden room. Inside, his flashlight flickered again, casting a pale glow over a grotesque shrine. Photographs lined the walls, old, faded family pictures, but not the kind he remembered. One showed his father, standing with an unfamiliar man, both surrounded by strange symbols. Dark, twisted symbols that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. The air grew colder. Evan's breath came out in frosty puffs, and then, from behind him, the door slammed shut on its own. Heart racing, he noticed an old tape recorder sitting on a dusty table. His hands trembled as he pressed play. His mother's panicked voice crackled through the speakers, her words rushed and frantic. "It's not safe here. Not anymore," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He's watching." The tape clicked off, leaving Evan in darkness. Chapter 5. Buried Truths. Evan bolted from the basement, his mother's whispered warning from the tape echoing in his mind. He's watching. The words clung to him, settling deep into his chest, squeezing his breath. Upstairs, the daylight had grown pale, casting long shadows across the floor. He needed answers. The basement's hidden shrine, the photographs, the symbols, it all pointed to something dark, something his family had been hiding. But why? And why had his father disappeared without a trace? His hands shook as he dialed Mr. Carter's number on the old landline. He couldn't stay in that house another second without understanding what he'd uncovered. Carter picked up on the second ring. "I need to know the truth, Carter," Evan demanded, his voice cracking. "About my father. What was he doing? What happened to him?" There was a long pause, the line crackling with static. "I told you before, son. That house isn't right. Your father, he was trying to connect with something from the other side. It wasn't natural. People in the town, they knew something was wrong, but we kept quiet. Your mother, she knew too, but by then, it was too late." What was he doing? Evan's voice rose, frustration bubbling over. What the hell was he trying to bring here? Mr. Carter's voice was grave, almost a whisper. He was playing with darkness, Evan. Rituals, inviting things into this world that don't belong. That house, it's not just haunted. It's alive, and it wants you. Evan's grip on the phone loosened, the words sinking in like ice in his veins. It wasn't just ghosts. It wasn't just his father. Something far more sinister had been lingering in that house for years, waiting. Panic clawed at Evan's throat. He grabbed his keys and stormed out to his car. He couldn't stay here. He had to leave. But when he turned the ignition, the engine sputtered and died. He tried again. Nothing. His chest heaved with anxiety. He glanced toward the road, but the more he stared, the more it seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees on either side closing in like skeletal fingers. The forest, thick and dark, seemed to shift, its branches moving as if alive, as if watching him. Trapped. Evan stumbled back into the house, his mind unraveling as reality blurred with nightmare. Time lost its meaning. The days passed in a haze of confusion, every room in the house shifting, warping. Every creak of the floorboards felt like something moving beneath the surface, watching, waiting for him to crack. On the third night, a figure appeared in the yard. Evan stared, eyes wide in disbelief. His breath caught in his throat. It was his father, standing perfectly still, looking exactly as he had the day he disappeared. Evan blinked, but the figure remained, unmoving in the shadows, waiting. Chapter 6. The Mirror. Evan couldn't look away. The figure standing in the yard was his father, frozen in time, just as he'd been before he disappeared. The air inside the house grew thick and suffocating, pressing down on Evan's chest. His father's eyes, distant yet piercing, seemed to beckon him without a word, drawing him deeper into a nightmare that refused to end. His hands trembled as he stepped back from the window, but every corner of the house whispered his name. Was his father real, or was his mind unraveling completely? Evan's grip on reality had slipped so far that he couldn't trust his own thoughts anymore. The house was alive. He could feel it breathing with him, its walls bending and shifting, like a living organism feeding on his fear. He wandered the halls, lost in a maze of rotting wood and decayed memories. Rooms no longer stayed where they should. One minute he was in the kitchen, the next he found himself in the hallway of his childhood, staring at a door he hadn't seen in decades. His reflection in the cracked mirror on the wall was distorted, barely recognizable. But it wasn't just his adult self. His younger self, wide-eyed, terrified, stared back at him too, a ghost of the past reliving the horrors he had forgotten. The walls seemed to bleed memories now, seeping out of the wood and into his mind. He saw his mother again, her face twisted with fear, and his father, standing by the fireplace, holding something Evan couldn't see. But what gnawed at him most was the ever-present darkness, lurking in the edges of his vision, pulling him toward the heart of the house. His father's ghost, or was it just a hallucination? Appeared again, this time at the end of the hallway. "Come," the figure whispered, its voice echoing in Evan's ears. "You need to understand." Against every instinct, Evan followed. The figure led him to a part of the house he hadn't seen since he was a child, a room hidden behind layers of decay. When he opened the door, the stale air inside hit him like a wave, and he knew immediately this was where his father had done the rituals. The room was a twisted mirror of the shrine he'd found in the basement. Symbols etched into the walls, pulsed faintly in the dim light, and an altar in the center of the room was surrounded by strange, unsettling objects, animal bones, burnt candles, and an open journal, its pages yellowed with age. Evan picked up the journal with shaking hands. Inside, his father's scrawled handwriting filled the page's notes about opening a gateway to something beyond human understanding, about tapping into forces that should never have been disturbed. His father had been obsessed, driven by a madness that Evan could feel creeping into him as he read. The final entry caught his eye, but the words were smeared, barely legible. Sacrifice. What is most precious? The gateway. Evan's blood turned cold. The meaning was clear, even if the words weren't. He wasn't just a child living in a haunted house. He had been the sacrifice. Chapter 7. The Ritual. Evan dropped the journal, his hands trembling as the horrifying truth sank in. His father's obsession with the rituals, the sacrifices, it had all been for nothing. The thing he had summoned, the dark force from beyond, wasn't just haunting the house, it had attached itself to him. All these years, it had been waiting, lurking in the shadows of his nightmares, biding its time. The figure in his dreams, the voice that called to him, it wasn't his father. It was the entity, twisted and hungry, using his father's form, to lure him deeper into madness. The house groaned, the walls closing in, pulsing with a malevolent energy that made the air heavy and thick. Shadows bled from the cracks in the ceiling, swirling around him like predators waiting for the kill. The whispers had turned into a cacophony of voices, overlapping and rising to a deafening pitch. They'd all said the same thing. "It's your turn." Panic clawed at Evan's chest, but through the fog of terror, a thought broke through. The journal. His father's notes. There had to be a way to stop it, to close the gateway before the entity consumed him completely. But time was running out. He could feel the weight of the entity's presence bearing down on him, pushing him to the brink. Racing through the house, Evan gathered everything he needed for the ritual candles: a knife, symbols drawn in chalk on the floor, his father's notes guiding him, though his hands shook with fear. Every second he delayed, the house became more hostile, more alive with the entity's rage. The walls throbbed like a beating heart, and the floor seemed to writhe beneath his feet. He stood in the center of the makeshift altar, the knife in his hand cold and heavy. The last part of the ritual demanded a sacrifice, not of blood, but of memory. Evan knew what he had to do. He had to give up the last thing tethering him to his humanity, his past, his childhood, the love he once had for his family. It had to go, or the entity would never stop. Tears welled in his eyes as he spoke the ancient words, his voice shaking. The shadows around him swirled faster, angry, resisting his every move. The entity wasn't going to let him go without a fight. Just as Evan completed the final incantation, the entity revealed itself, its true form. A grotesque, twisted version of his father, its face distorted with the screams of the souls it had claimed over the years. The voices of the lost echoed through the room, begging, pleading with him to stop, to give in. But Evan gripped the knife tighter, his heart pounding as he stared into the eyes of the thing that had haunted him his whole life. He wasn't going to let it win. As he plunged the knife into the floor, the house roared around him, shaking with the fury of the entity. And then, silence. Chapter 8. The Ruins Consume. Evan's heart raced as the entity loomed before him, a monstrous distortion of his father, its features warped by centuries of darkness. The air crackled with malice, and the whispers grew into a deafening roar, drowning out his thoughts. Memories surged within him, moments of joy and terror, his childhood intertwined with the horrors of the past. But he could no longer run from them. He had to confront not just the evil his father had unleashed, but also the guilt he had buried deep. "Why did you forget?" the entity hissed, its voice a twisted echo of his father's. "Why did you abandon me?" Evan felt the weight of those words pressing down, as if the very walls of the house were closing in on him. He could see flashes of his past, a little boy hiding under the stairs, the laughter of children cut short, his mother's terrified face. With each memory, the entity grew stronger, pulling him into visions that clawed at his sanity. He saw himself spiraling into madness, just like his father, lost in the depths of the house, forever consumed by the darkness that dwelled within. "No!" Evan shouted, forcing himself to focus. He had to finish the ritual. The knife felt heavy in his hand, the power of the incantation coursing through him. He fought against the entity's grip on his mind, the darkness that threatened to swallow him whole. With a fierce determination, he recited the final words of the spell, his voice rising above the cacophony. The shadows writhed, the entity screaming in fury as Evan pushed through the pain, pulling strength from every fiber of his being. He could feel the memories of his childhood tugging at him, but he refused to let them drown him. Instead, he embraced them, acknowledging the fear, the love, and the pain. "I am not you," he roared, plunging the knife into the ground. The house trembled as the energy surged, light bursting forth from the earth as the entity howled in rage. In an explosion of darkness, the entity writhed and twisted, its screams morphing into a cacophony of voices, his father's, his mother's, all the souls trapped within the ruins. With a final, earth-shattering roar, the entity was pulled into the ground, banished back to the darkness from which it had come. But the victory came at a cost. The house began to collapse around him, the walls groaning as they cracked and splintered. Dust filled the air, choking him as he stumbled through the chaos. He could hear the structure failing, the foundation giving way, the echoes of memories crashing down alongside him. Evan burst through the front door, just as the roof caved in behind him. He fell to his knees in the yard, gasping for air, the smoldering ruins of his childhood home towering before him. The darkness was gone, but the price had been steep. As the dust settled, he forced himself to look back one last time. The remnants of the house lay scattered, but among the debris, a shadowy figure stood, still and silent, watching him leave. A chill crawled down his spine. Evan stood, turning away from the ruins, the weight of the past heavy on his shoulders. He began to walk away, but the lingering gaze of that shadow stayed with him, a reminder that some ghosts never truly fade. Freedom felt elusive, and as he left town, he couldn't shake the feeling that the past may never fully be escaped.